Hello, welcome back to Protecting Our Planet with me, Dallas Campbell.
And me, Susie Ember.
We've been all over the place already. We've been to Egypt, we've been to Antarctica, we've been to the bottom of the ocean. A bit of a change of scene now.
Yes, we are on to our session all about forests. And hosting this session, we have Professor Richard Lucas. And he is in a forest, live in a forest.
I want to say in a kind of Ewok village, but I don't think he is in an Ewok.
I don't know. He's outside the
village.
Centre of Alternative Technology in Wales, and he is going to lead our conversation on the importance of forests relating to climate change.
Okay. We have a little technical issue in our forest. Unfortunately, he can't hear us and we can't hear him. So what we're going to do is we're going to send some carrier pigeons to Wales and try and fix the microphone that way. I've got to say, actually, there's a lot of talk about trees generally in terms of climate change and planting trees. I read in the newspaper today that China was going to plant over 1 billion trees, and of course, trees are a natural absorber of carbon dioxide. Oh, we're going to maybe go back. Oh, we're going to play a little video I'm hearing, which will explain more about what forests do and what Richard is doing in his forest.
Excellent.
We are in a mangrove forest in New South Wales, Australia. You can see behind me, we've got the grey mangrove, Abyssinia marina. If you look around me as well, you can see that there's a bit of water sitting around, and mangroves are adapted to live in environments that are inundated by tides. They usually receive a tide at least once or twice a day. That makes the environment really inhospitable for normal terrestrial plants. But mangroves have these special adaptations that allow them to live in these more harsher environments. One of the key things they have is different root structures to allow them to live in an environment that's inundated, perhaps has a little less oxygen available in the substrate, or to deal with salt that comes in with tides. What we see in this case is we've got the grey mangrove with pneumatophores. These pneumatophores are much like a snorkel. So the tide can come in and the snorkel can stay out of the water for most of the time that the tide is in. Might be overtopped for a short period. They can hold their breath for that length of time, and then the tide goes back out and they're happy again. There are about 40 species of mangroves around the world. The diversity is greatest in the Indo-Pacific region, and they're largely tropical plants. The diversity diminishes as you move away from the tropics. I'm currently standing in temperate zone of Australia. There's only about 2 species of mangrove that occur in this region. If you go up to the tropical north of Australia, there's more than 35 species that occur. Mangrove forests are coastal ecosystems, and people love to live near the coast as well. As a consequence of this, mangrove forests are under significant threats from people. We clear mangrove forests for many reasons. We clear mangrove forests to create agricultural land, or to build cities, or for coastal developments and foreshore developments. We also clear mangroves to generate aquaculture, or fish and shrimp. This is particularly prominent throughout Southeast Asia. And increasingly, mangroves are being cleared for palm oil forestry purposes as well. In some parts of the world, mangrove forests are cleared because the timber of the mangrove is actually important for the livelihoods of people, because mangrove forests provide a huge range of ecosystem services. Climate change is no longer a looming threat. Climate change is happening now. And for mangroves, there's a range of changes to the climate that will impact it. One of the most profound changes that's already occurring is sea level rise. And sea level rise presents a significant threat for mangrove forests, partly because they occur right near mean sea level. Mangrove forests will need to move their locations as they adapt to sea level rise. In some parts of the world, the climate is very variable. Temperature changes a lot and rainfall availability changes too. This is the case in Northern Australia. And as an outcome of this climatic variability, there's been significant changes in the amount of rainfall occurring over the monsoonal wet season. And there's also been significant changes in temperature and sea level over this period. Coincident with all of that has been a significant dieback event right across Northern Australia, where many mangroves were literally starved of water. Climate change will also modify our climate in other ways. One of the things that we know is going to happen is that the frequency of storm events is going to change. As mangrove forests occur in the tropics, they're particularly vulnerable to cyclones and hurricanes. You might wonder what we can do to reduce the threats and risks to mangrove forests. The number one most important thing we can do is reduce our emissions of carbon into the atmosphere. This will modify or change the rates of sea level rise that are going to occur throughout this century. This will also allow mangrove forests to continue pulling carbon from the atmosphere and contributing to mitigating climate change. There's other factors that are also important. We need to consider the pollution that we do in coastal environments. We need to consider the developments that are occurring. We need to consider our use of palm oil and our consumption of shrimp aquaculture. We also need to consider education and informing people about the benefits that mangrove forests provide. One of the most important things that local governments and national governments can do is start to protect mangrove forests because of the huge range of benefits we get from them. And we need to start planning for their adaptation to sea level rise. This means putting away reserves and migration pathways for mangrove forests as they're trying to adjust to climate change.
Do you know some tigers live in mangrove swamps? Surprising, isn't it? Yes, it is true, but not in all places, except like Sundarbans in India and Bangladesh. Sundarbans is also known as the world's largest continuous patch of mangrove forest. The ferocious big cat, Royal Bengal tiger, lives here in Sundarbans. I was told that local people who enter this forest wear a face mask behind to protect themselves from the big cats. The reason is very simple. As you know, tigers attack the prey from the backside. In fact, all tigers are not man-eaters. According to the villagers, they attack people in self-defense and less food due to increased tourism and deforestation nowadays.
Tropical forests are distributed near the equator. They are rich in biodiversity and store substantial amounts of carbon, with amounts being greatest worldwide. They are, however, suffering from extensive deforestation and degradation and are increasingly vulnerable to fire and climate change. There are many efforts now to work towards their conservation and restoration, including putting the areas in protection.
Coming to the protected rainforest areas like Taman Negara in Malaysia, which is 130 million years old, there are several wildlife populations, including the biggest terrestrial mammals called elephants. So you will see elephant crossing signboards all along the road while traveling next to this national park. Not only signboards, but also in action if you are lucky. In Malaysia, elephants are a totally protected species. However, there are only 12 to 1600 individuals in entire peninsular Malaysia. The elephant population is further declining due to increased demand of Malaysian timber all over the world. Importantly, the lowland forests, which are prime habitats for the elephants, are converted into oil palm and rubber plantations. As forests are cleared, the elephant range is becoming fragmented. Therefore, they are entering agricultural lands and other plantation sites for their food. This is ultimately causing human-elephant conflict in many countries, including Malaysia. No doubt, the world's forest cover is diminishing very fast. So, the global leaders have taken a oath recently to end their deforestation activities by 2030. Let us hope this happens without any compromise. As academicians, let us also make a promise to save trees, save forests, and save wildlife to finally protect our mother planet. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Peter Scarth, a University of Queensland scientist presenting from savannas in Australia. Savannas cover approximately 20% of the Earth's land area. They're a globally important ecosystem that provides habitat for thousands of highly specialised plants and animals, as well as a home for a quarter of the world's population. Savannas are a grassy woodland ecosystem characterised by the trees being sufficiently widely spaced so the canopy does not close, as you can see behind me. This allows light to reach the ground, supporting a layer of grasses. These nutritious grasses can support many large herbivores. In Australia, we have kangaroos and emus, and in other countries, savannas can support zebras, wildebeests, elephants, giraffes, ostriches, gazelles, buffalo, maybe even anteaters. They also support domestic livestock, like sheep, cows, and goats in many places. This grazing can sometimes cause the pasture to degrade and woody weeds to increase. Farmers and scientists are working hard to manage the impacts of grazing to stop this degradation and improve the condition of the savanna. Savannas are primarily located in areas having warm to hot climates, such as here in Australia. They are often subject to regular burning, with the entire ecosystem believed to be the result of human use of fire. In Australia, managed burning by First Nations Australians seems to have been responsible for the widespread occurrence of savannas across the country. Savannas have been cleared of trees across large parts of Australia and in South America as well, primarily to improve pasture production. But in many countries, the introduction of laws to control land clearing and consumer pressure for deforestation-free meat has resulted in a dramatic and continuing decline in land clearing. Savannas are also distinguished by seasonal water availability. Most rainfall is confined to one season and they experience droughts and floods regularly. Climate change might alter the structure and function of the savannas, making them more susceptible to being degraded. Scientists are working in partnership with the people who live and work in them to understand these challenges and to develop methods to better manage these complex and interconnected systems in the face of all these challenges. Our global savannas have proven time and time again to be productive, resilient, and responsive to all sorts of changes when managed well. I love spending time in these savannas and I love observing and understanding them. It's been great that you've been here with me today.
My name is Good Sonnenschein, and I'm standing here in a mountain forest in the Central European Alps. Mountain forests grow on almost all slopes and range from the valley bottoms up to the tree line, where climate conditions are too harsh for trees to grow. Mountains are the water towers of our planet, and mountain forests are critical for the quantity and quality of our drinking water. not only in the mountain regions, but far further downstream also in the lowlands. Mountain forests are also important to prevent soil erosion and to protect our infrastructure and buildings against natural hazards such as rockfalls, landslides, and avalanches. Climate change is increasingly threatening mountain forests, and warming trends in mountains are twice as high as the global average. On the one hand, we see an increase of natural hazards, which is linked to the melting of permafrost. On the other hand, there's also an increase of extreme climate events, such as storm events, and both lead to the damage, but also loss of mountain forest. But it's not only this. A drier and warmer climate also weakens mountain tree species, while the conditions for pests are getting more favorable. For example, this year we had here a very dry but also hot spring, which led to a massive outbreak of bark beetles in this region, killing large forest stands on steep slopes. In my work, I use satellite data to monitor mountain forests, and I derive spatial maps about changing conditions. I closely work together with the local forest service that is in charge to manage mountain forests and interacts also with the forest owners. With the information I provide, they are able to better decide which measures to take to best preserve the multiple functions of the forest now, but also for the future.
Hi there, welcome to the boreal forest. So I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite forested ecosystems because I am from Canada and I grew up here in the boreal. These are forests that cover the very vast expanses of northern parts of the planet. So places like Canada, Siberia, Eurasia, these are cold on average, but there's a ton of seasonality. So really cold and dark in the winter, really bright and sunny in the summer. And they have a lot of really special adaptations to these northern latitudes. These are made up primarily of coniferous trees, like the spruce trees you see behind me. But also there's a lot of broadleaf species, things like birch and aspen. You have a lot of birds that will migrate from these forests in the summer back down to more southern places. Other animals that you kind of associate with boreal forests include bears, deer, moose, wolves, coyotes, and then of course a ton of birds. Those birds include owls, grouse, woodpeckers, and a lot of migratory birds. They do grow a lot slower than other forests, than other tree species that you would find in the tropics or temperate systems. But because they're so large, even a little bit of slow growth sequesters a ton of carbon out of the atmosphere and stores it both in the trees themselves, but also pumps it into the soils. But they're also very important in nature and people. So we use a lot of timber from boreal forests and other natural resources. These forests are under a lot of threat. So both from logging, we've been logging the boreal forest since since people arrived in the boreal forest. And unfortunately, we're kind of shifting toward more sustainable practices there. But there's a lot of like mining activities that go on in parts of the boreal. And so we have to pay a lot of attention to making sure that these areas are being protected and that especially forestry activities going on are sustainable. Climate change is one of the most important threats to northern forests. So these places are heating up faster than anywhere else on the planet. You have heating up and drying out of these ecosystems. You have droughts, you have increasing fire, you have pests that can all of a sudden come up, like insects that can live at higher latitudes and attack the trees there. So there's a lot of disturbance. And because they're such slow growing forests, it takes a little bit more time. So we've got to be a little gentle with these forests. Climate change is also kind of interesting here because we're starting to see boreal forests shift further north. There's a lot of change going on in these areas. We are also seeing that there is an increase in sustainable forestry. Instead of like clear cutting an area, kind of thinning it out, taking the trees and using them for things like timber, but not in a way that degrades the quality of the ecosystem. So it's exciting to see a lot of the partnerships between commercial timber companies, environmental organizations, and indigenous peoples. And hopefully we will see a more sustainable boreal in the future. But researchers are also keeping a really close eye on these forests as they respond to climate change.
Hello, I'm Professor Richard Lucas from Wollongong University. I'm here today to talk to you about the Celtic rainforest of Wales.
Celtic rainforests occur mainly on the western coast of Great Britain in Wales, but also Scotland, England, Ireland, and all the way down to Europe. These rainforests are really unique. They were formed after the last glaciation. They've been here ever since. They're also very diverse in terms of plant and animal species. This is because they live in areas where there's more than 3,000 millimeters of rainfall per year and the temperature is quite mild. They have this closed canopy which allows them to maintain the moisture content. This allows a large diversity of species of lichens, mosses, and liverworts in particular to live here, and these communities are some of the most diverse in the world. There are also a wide range of wild animals that make this place home. These include polecats and also residents and summer migrant birds such as pied flycatchers, redstarts, and wood warblers. And these come all the way from Africa every year to come and breed in these forests.
Celtic rainforests used to be far more extensive than they are today. Currently, they occupy about 100 kilometers square, but they are confined primarily now to the steep valleys and the ravine that you see behind me. In the past, they've been cleared for mining to basically fuel the mines themselves, and also they have been replaced by coniferous and other hardwood plantations, primarily because these are more productive. Many areas have been lost to agriculture, for example, for sheep grazing. Those forests that remain are still threatened because there are invasive plants, for example, such as rhododendron, which cause a loss of species diversity in the understory. And there is also the potential of pathogens. There's a lot of hope for these rainforests in the future. Although they take a long time to grow, efforts have been undertaken to try and expand their range and to also to manage them more effectively through grazing by horses and cattle and also sheep in some cases. A lot of hope for the future, and we really would love you to be involved. First of all, just by understanding these forests and recognizing their value, that's really critical. Otherwise, nobody's going to keep these forests in the future. Visiting them, exploring them, telling people about the value of something that's very precious to Wales and to the United Kingdom and to the world. There's lots of efforts going on to try and increase the extent of these rainforests, but also their condition. So activities include removal of rhododendron to increase the diversity of the understory, and also trialing out different grazing regimes using horses and cattle and sheep, but not intensively. There's lots of ways of making sure that their values are recognized, both nationally and internationally, and also by working with other countries, including in the UK and overseas, we can start to see a real future for these forests. They're very valuable, beautiful places to visit, and really, let's make a big effort to try and conserve them for future generations. You might wonder why our presenters are all wearing blue. That's because you can be seen against the green background of vegetation. This is much less visible, and so I'd like to thank all the presenters of Australia, Malaysia, the United States, and Italy for contributing so much to this video. Thank you, guys.
I could just sit and watch that all day.
Yeah, it's fantastic, especially the drone footage of all those amazing forests.
Really,
beautiful.
really amazing. We've got some questions from our schools. Thank you very, very much for your questions. We're going to try and come back to Richard, our Professor Richard Lucas, who we had a few technical problems, and we think he's been abducted by Ewoks at the moment, but we may get him back. But in the meantime, here's a question from Lizaus. Am I pronouncing that right, Susie?
Not sure.
Lizaus High School, I hope I am. how will climate change affect forest fires? I think that's a really good question.
Me too, and we have some experts on the line to answer your questions. We have a couple of experts here. We're going to have Bahara from Malaysia and Peter from Australia. So Bahara and Peter, thank you so much for joining us. And Richard is there as well.
Richard's here. He wasn't
stuff.
abducted by you all, so I apologise.
Fantastic. So yeah, our question is, how does climate change affect forest wildfires? Anyone can just dive in if you have an answer, and we can go around. Any thoughts?
I think one of the things that I can explain here is that we have, in Australia, there was this massive bushfires, and I'll pass it on to Peter, but certainly it increases the likelihood of dry conditions in very dry years. So you sort of get, high temperatures on encourage and strong winds encourage fires to fan through. And when you get really wet years, like in Australia at the minute, they get the forest fuel loads building up, so lots of plant growth. So these extremes are causing, quite a big flux in lots of fuel loads, and then lots of fire, and then lots of fuel loads again, and so on. So you can see all the fires down here. And also we've got some fires from Western Australia. And I'll let Peter have a follow-on from that, if that's okay, Peter. If Peter can hear us.
Peter, can you hear us? Are you there?
Yep.
I'm not sure Peter is there. Well, just quickly.
Yeah, I think Peter is there. I think Richard was just asking you a little bit about forest fires in Australia, Peter, if you'd like to tell us a bit about that.
All right. I couldn't hear any of that. Yeah, certainly. So what we've seen some fairly major fires in Australia recently. Back in, 2020, we had huge bushfires here. And that came about because we have these sort of long-term climate cycles within Australia, where sort of every 10 years we get this El Nino and La Nina event. We basically came out of a very long drought period. The understory in the forest layer really dried out, and so as soon as we had a bit of a lightning or some ignition events, everything went up. So there was two things that were going on there. One is climate change is modifying the climate of Australia to a certain extent, but the other thing is we had a very prolonged drought period, and so the two of those things combined meant that the conditions were almost perfect for fairly horrific bushfires that spread across much of the east coast of Australia. Since then, it's become much wetter. The last couple of years, we've seen a lot of floods across the coast of Australia. So, we're probably unlikely to see, at least on the east coast, too many fires this year.
That's interesting. One question that struck me from that is, as the temperature of the Earth increases, people talk about planting more and more trees as a way to combat that. But if we're going to get more forest fires, isn't that going to therefore just release more carbon because more trees are going to burn down?
Yeah, that's a good question. One would hope not. So the more trees that you plant, trees are fantastic at reflecting light back off the planet. So they look green to us, but in sort of the infrared ranges where there's a lot of heat, they're almost as good as a mirror. So they reflect a lot of heat back off into space from the sun. And so planting lots of trees helps cool the planet down. So that's number one. And trees do capture carbon. If they actually catch fire and burn down, that carbon is released, but they don't release more carbon than they captured in the first place. So there's no net disadvantage to planting lots of trees.
Great stuff. We have some more questions here. Maybe this is one for Bahara to answer. One of our students would like to know how long it takes for a forest to become established. Bahara, can you hear us?
Yes. Sorry. People call me Satyam, that's why I was confused.
Okay. Forgive me.
Sorry, I'm extremely sorry. Actually, the forest depends on type of the forest. For example, in the case of mangroves, we have some kind of silvicultural management in Malaysia. So the forest, like mangroves, they cut down to make charcoal, the black charcoal. So once we clear fell the trees, and again we are going to plant the trees. That kind of stocking, either it could be through the natural recruitment, or it could be artificial plantation. So either way, it takes almost 30 years to have a mangrove forest, grown up mangrove forest that can be utilized for the charcoal production again. So on an average, 25 to 30 years takes for an optimum growth of the mangroves to have the natural, structural properties.
Fantastic. And Peter or Richard, maybe you can tell us a bit about some of the oldest forests that we have on planet Earth. We've been thinking about how long it takes to get established, maybe decades. Some of our forests presumably are much, much older than that. Maybe Richard could give us some insight.
Yeah, no, there's some forests, there's some I know of in Tasmania, which, 2,000 years old, and some are even older than that. So they can last for a very, very long time. I think what's really important is that one of the younger forests that people see today, they're not old. Some of the old growth forests being logged, for example. So you're left with trees which are quite small. They don't have many hollows, so for things like owls and woodpeckers and parrots in Australia and so on, you don't get the hollows in these smaller trees as they cut down before they mature. So what you really want to do is get that maturity, that structural development of all those layers, get lots of different understories and different layers coming through. Like the tropics is about 3 or 4 different layers of forest structure in the tropics. And that structural development is really important for biodiversity. The more structure you have, the more species you tend to have and so on. But it takes a long time to get that structure going forward and to get things like hollows and really the important ecosystem components in place. So it's a bit of a waiting game, which is difficult in this society because, people don't tend to wait for forests to grow, but we need to wait. We need to plan and plant our forests for the future.
Fantastic. We've been learning about different types of forests and the importance of forests, and I think a lot of our viewers are students at school who are wondering, and there's a few questions that have come up here, particularly Moorside High School, asking about what the biggest threat is to our forests, and Duke Secondary School, how do we protect the forest from human activities? Perhaps we can go to Peter for this one.
Ooh, that's a tricky one for me in a savanna, because savannas have really come about from that sort of interaction with humans for a long period through time. But in terms of protecting the forest, there's a number of things you can do, I suppose. One is, in a lot of areas, one of the biggest threats to forest is deforestation for grazing and for growing crops, so palm oil and things like that. So you can look very carefully at where your food products come from and purchase them from ethical producers that haven't sourced them from areas where there has been deforestation. And that's probably the biggest pressure you can put on sort of large corporations to change the practice in terms of, I guess, cutting down forests. The other way is to sort of lobby governments to enact protection for forests, so that, the forests that we have got left, particularly the intact forests, so those really old forests that Richard was talking about, the ones that have been around for a long time, remain protected and remain, I guess, resilient against, future potential climate change in those areas.
I have a question which is about technology. We're here in Southampton surrounded by amazing technology that lets us explore the oceans, these autonomous submarines. And I'm just wondering, things like Earth observation, the idea of having satellites that can monitor the Earth. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the importance of that when it comes to deforestation. Can we look at forests from space and actually take the temperature of the Earth, as it were, and look at the forests and see what needs to be done and see what problems there are? That's a question for anyone.
Yeah, I can answer that because I've got a bit of display here. So going back through what we're doing in terms of using Earth observation data. So for the temperate, I talked about the temperate forests in Wales, and basically we've got the Living Wales project, which is producing very detailed maps of the forest cover for Wales, and it's openly available data through the Living Wales website. And what we can do is map things like canopy cover, the species, the biomass, and so on. So, and we can start to look at changes. So we start to look at how these forests are changing. As I mentioned before, we're using the same technology in Wales as we are in Australia. So this is the whole continent has been mapped for 33 years. And we can see the fires in here, and you can see the burn scars and the flooding, and it gives you a really nice idea of what's been happening to that landscape as well. If I go to the boreal forest, which which Laura talked about, we have, the boreal is in Canada, it's in Finland and so on. And so we've been working with the European Space Agency, but also with NASA and the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency to try and look at biomass maps. So this is a harmonization activity, and we're looking at how different satellites from these agencies can be used to retrieve the carbon content of the forest. So you can see, there's quite a lot of carbon in the dark green, but on the boreal forest, there's not much per hectare, but there's lots of boreal forest. And Peter will say the same in the savannas as well. So, and this is where Ruth was. This is in Bolzano. Here's Venice here. So we got, they're using satellites for looking at biomass. Again, this is the Italian Alps. And there's one on the International Space Station called the JEDI, which is a spaceborne LiDAR. And that gives you that structural profile of forest as well as biomass, which I've talked about is so important. The other thing we've been using is using data for mangroves. So mangroves, what Kerry Lee was talking about, these global maps, this is Northern Australia. So using these radar technologies which see through the cloud and the sort of optical data that measure the reflectance, we can map mangroves over multiple years from the 1990s onwards. And there's change alerts going in as well. So we can actually start to look at change alerts going to see where mangroves have been lost, because they're huge stores of carbon. So the technology allows us now almost very regularly to sort of see where deforestation is happening and actually try to prevent it happening or try to plan landscapes much better. And most importantly, I guess, is we've also got Climate from Space, which is the European Space Agency initiative as well, where we can actually start to bring in different layers from lots of different satellites to address a whole lot of pressures that lead to the impacts of the forest. And so you can go through into Climate from Space, explore that one from here. So here we go. And you've got different data layers. So we have things like glaciers, and you can move around here, move around the Earth, and you can look at fires, and you can have time series going back in time as well. So there's lots and lots and lots of ways of looking at the environment from satellite data.
I am always absolutely amazed by what technology can do for us. And whilst technology is not some kind of silver bullet, it lets us much more accurately understand how our planet is changing and what we're doing, and how we can therefore make decisions which will make it better. I've had a lot of questions as a sort of final thought. Lots of people are asking about sort of biodiversity, but particularly about species and how species in forests are declining, if they're declining. Do we have any kind of numbers about that in terms of sort of health of animals?
Let Peter answer that, and I'll come back on that as well, if that's all right, Peter.
Sure. Peter.
Oh, that was me, passing to me. Yes, look, I think it depends where you are. So obviously the bushfires that we had in Australia caused a massive decline in species because it effectively sterilised the bottom layer of the forest. In many places, though, there is, I guess we're seeing a recovery in species. So as we go through the natural cycles in the savanna regions, particularly in Australia, of sort of dry and then wet, we get an influx of species at certain times of year, or in certain parts of the decade, and they sort of go away at other times when it's a lot drier. What we're seeing with larger numbers of protected areas, and particularly in the savanna regions, with farmers grazing more, I guess, harmoniously with nature, so not really overgrazing and grazing with the trees in place as well, is that we're seeing a recovery. Particularly a lot of bird species are coming back in. We're seeing a lot of sort of reptiles come in, so lizards and snakes are moving back into areas where there weren't any before. So in general, across sort of broad areas of Australia at least, there's a recovery in many places of a broader, I guess, biodiverse ecosystem that we haven't seen for a number of years.
Great, thank you very much for that.
Peter was just going to...
Peter, you got...
Oh, hang on. Richard, were you going
to...
Or was it Richard was going to...
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on that because Satyan was talking about tigers and elephants. And tigers are actually doing pretty well in India. There's good protection measures going in there, and elephants, like stopping deforestation and just starting to put up conservation. Protected areas are really important. It's just the way going to go forward, really, but sort of really respect nature as well. And I say when we come to sort of looking at landscapes, like we got this one for Wales, we can use these landscapes to look at species distributions and modelling about where the birds are in different species and so on. And then you can start to plan future landscapes, get a real positive outlook. How do we plan the restoration of biodiversity? Because biodiversity is in a really bad way, and there's a lot less of it than there used to be, both in terms of the number of species, but also the number of individuals. And so we really need to address that quite urgently, because land clearing, pollution, and climate change in particular is really changing things. So we've got to make sure that our ecosystems are resilient so we don't lose these species. We mustn't lose these species.
Thank you so much. We have to wrap up now. We could talk to you all day about forests. It's so fascinating. Thank you to all of you for joining us today, and thank you, Richard, as well, from Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales. If you're interested more in finding out about the forests and the environments that we've been discussing, you can find lots of links in the Q&A to follow, including some websites with our climate change educational partnership, the Natural History Museum, Royal Geographical Society, the Royal Society, and others. Don't forget, if you're joining us for the STEM Club's hour at the end of the day, you can find downloads for activities. Don't forget to get everything ready in time on the protectingourplanet.org.uk website. Lots of ideas there for you.
I'm still in the dark about what we're doing for that. Apparently we're doing some terrifying challenges.
We are also joining you in some activities in STEM Clubs, but no one will tell us what they are, so we're looking forward to that as well.
And don't forget, if you have got an activity that you're doing at school, reach out to some climate experts and invite them along to your school, get them involved. We can put links to how you might be able to do that up there too. Coming up in 5 minutes, we're going to take a little break, but we have done ice, we have done oceans, we've looked at forests, we're going to be looking at the earth, we're going to be looking at peat bogs, I believe. We'll see you in 5 minutes.